We head now to the eastern parts of the continent where Kenya's President William Ruto has met with parliamentary leaders from both the Senate and the National Assembly to plan the bipartisan approach to issues raised by opposition leader Raila Odinga. This comes hours after Odinga called off his Monday and Thursday demonstrations to allow the president to act on the opposition's grievances. In a tweet on President Ruto's official Twitter handle, he noted that he asked parliamentary leadership of both houses to consider the issue a priority. On Monday, Kenya's top prosecutor dropped charges against 4 lawmakers over anti-government protests a day after opposition leader Raila Odinga suspended the demonstrations. Odinga said on Sunday that he was ready for talks with President William Ruto as long as authorities halted arrests and prosecutions connected to the protest, among other conditions. The 4 opposition lawmakers, who included the leaders of Odinga's faction in both houses of parliament, were arrested and charged with unlawful assembly in late March, then released on bail. Thousands have taken part in 3 marches over the past 2 weeks against high cost of living and alleged fraud in last year's elections. The protest had turned violent, but a 4th rally slated for today was called off. Meanwhile, the East African bloc, IGAD, has praised Kenyan President William Ruto and opposition leader Raila Odinga for agreeing to hold talks aimed at ending 2 weeks of protest about the cost of living and electoral reforms. In a tweet, IGAD's Executive Secretary Wakna Gabayahu said that the 2 leaders' move would help resolve differences on national issues through peaceful means and preserve Kenya's unity and constitutional order. Kenya's opposition leader Raila Odinga had on Sunday said his political coalition had called off its protest plan for Monday in response to what he called an olive branch from President Ruto. To discuss this, joining me now is Declan Galvin, head of Insights Information and Intelligence at WS Insight. Declan, welcome to NC Continental Prime, and I guess I'll say welcome to Lagos as well. It's good to see you here on this side.
Thank you for having me.
So in terms of the process we've seen so far, President William Ruto is meeting with parliamentary leaders to have a bipartisan approach to responding to the grievances that the opposition has laid out. Was this really the aim all along, finding a way to force Ruto's hand to come to the table with Odinga?
I think definitely one way or another, it was always going to need to come to some kind of engagement between these 2 leaders around their differences, whether those are economic, political, or governance-related issues otherwise.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of this, we know that Odinga called off his Monday and Thursday demonstrations, but he said that they could resume if there was no progress. What kind of progress is he referring to? Is this a sort of winner-takes-all, give me access to the computers as he has demanded and do something about the cost of living, which is right now a universal conversation, or is it a piecemeal? What are we looking at when it comes to this progress?
So ultimately, the problem set that we've seen is driven through politics, and this is going to be a political solution. So in order for there to be anything sustainable, there's going to need to be a middle road between these 2 leaders. And so whether they stick to the open up the server dialogue, or if having a more permanent or official role for the opposition in governance, we'll see how that plays out, particularly over the next week.
So Kenyan prosecutors have also dropped charges against 4 lawmakers over anti-government protests. Is that a compromise? Do you think that's a bit of an olive branch? But then I'd also have to ask, what about the hundreds of Kenyans who've also been arrested in regards to these protests?
Sure. So what's really interesting is if you look at the rhetoric over the last 48 hours, arrests were brought up quite a bit. And so I think that that's clear that the detention of leaders supporting Odinga has been a really important sticking point. I'm sure that to a large extent that helped motivate Odinga to kind of come to the table and to call off demonstrations as well. As I understand, the other kind of lesser known demonstrators that were arrested or were going to have charges laid against them, I understand that they'll also be dropped and people will be released.
Okay, so it's interesting we talk about these releases, but this is a situation that many have worried could disintegrate into the type of violence that Kenya did witness a few years ago, almost a decade ago, when it comes to electoral violence. Do you have that same worry? Do we see sort of pointers that are leading us to say that if this had not been called off and had been allowed to continue to sort of snowball, we could see that level of violence? So
I think we need to really kind of unpack the violence that we saw in 2007 and 2008. and it's really important for everybody, not just your audience, but anybody looking at these issues. The overwhelming majority of Kenyans do not participate in political violence. Those who do are a very small minority and are almost always sponsored by politicians. So the fear is not that Kenyans will kind of devolve, and I know that that wasn't your question, but the fear is that politicians will become incentivized to identify the more impressionable elements of their support base to motivate them toward violence, which could then kind of create fear, spiral out of control. That's the issue. And what was so concerning on last Monday's demonstrations is for the first time in a long time, we saw evidence of political incitement toward violence in a way that didn't feel like it was being controlled or arbitrated by the state. And so that was a concern. It definitely rekindled those old fears, and I think this is why we saw so much domestic and international push last week in order to have mediation.
So interestingly, on two sides of the continent, the West and the East, we're having questions about the integrity of elections. In Nigeria, we see that coming up. In Kenya, we see that coming up. Two large economies, two very central players on the continent as well. And young people who are, in a way, caught in the middle because they were the ones who determined some of the winners in these elections. What do you make of this? And we can't leave South Africa out. They have an election coming in 2024. Sure. We saw a wave of coups in West Africa in the past few years. There's just an uneasy tension, I think, that many people are feeling across sub-Saharan Africa at this moment. What do you think?
So, look, Africa is the most dynamic region on the planet, right? From a political, from a social, from an economic sense, it's very exciting. And part of the reason it's exciting is because we have so many young people who are absorbing technology, different kinds of innovations. There are governance systems and political systems that do not work. And so young people have a larger role and voice to play in reshaping these systems, but you can't have change without consternation. And that's certainly what we're seeing in all the countries you just mentioned.
So finally, Declan, before I let you go, in terms of an expectation of possibly having protesters return to the streets, if maybe the talks fall apart, what are we looking at here? Do we see that middle ground, as you spoke about, being found, or do we see the opposition holding out? Because the demands they seem quite basic, 3 or 4 things that opposition is really asking about.
Sure, I'm sure that there's also going to be a number of unstated demands that would be more comfortable spoken about kind of in a private setting, and those may matter more than what's been publicly stated. But if these things fall apart, and if Ruto and Odinga aren't able to come to some kind of agreement, then we'll start seeing protests again. And Odinga and the other Azimio leaders said that yesterday, that if they don't see a good pathway toward some kind of reconciliation on their demands, then they will continue to use demonstrations.
All right, Declan, thank you so much for joining me. We'll leave the conversation at that.